I would love to go over the more significant battles that took place in that first 6 months of Korea in 1950. So if you guys will, let's dive on into this great stuff. And I will say that all the battles that I'm going to be talking about for the next few episodes, these were not the only battles that America participated in during the Korean War. A lot of people would actually consider these some of the more significant or important battles that America participated in, though. So this video and the next series of videos is dedicated to our Korean War veterans who sacrificed their lives, their youth, and a bunch of stuff in order to protect us here at home. So thank you guys very, very much. And with that being said, the very first battle that we're going to talk about today is none other than the Battle of Osan. Now, the Battle of Osan is significant because it was the first engagement between U.S. forces and North Korean forces, and actually took place on July 5th, 1950. Now, on the U.S. side, the main combatant was Task Force Smith, which was basically a force consisting of about 400 infantry U.S. Army soldiers that were supported by an artillery battery, and this was an attempt basically to break down the Iron Wall of North Korea progressing southward to take over the peninsula. And Osan was very important at the time because Osan was just south of the South Korean capital of Seoul, and Task Force Smith was ordered to fight as a rear guard in order to further delay the advancing North Koreans, while additional U.S. troops were arriving in Korea from all over the country in order to form a stronger defense line in the south around Pusan. The task force lacked both anti-tank guns and effective infantry anti-tank weapons, having only been equipped with obsolete 2.36-inch rocket launchers, as well as a few 57mm recoilless rifles. Now, aside from a limited number of heat shells for the unit's 105mm howitzers, crew-served weapons capable of defeating the T-34 Soviet tank had not been distributed to U.S. Army forces in Korea at that time. In fact, a North Korean tank column equipped with ex-Soviet T-34/85 tanks overran Task Force Smith in the first encounter and continued its advance south. After the North Korean tank column had breached U.S. lines, Task Force Smith opened fire on a force of some 5,000 North Korean infantry soldiers approaching its position, which basically caused it to temporarily hold off and delay the North Koreans from advancing further southward. So basically, with the defeat of Task Force Smith at the Battle of Osan, North Korean forces continued their advance southwards toward Pusan. Now, Pusan is considered one of the last major ports for South Korea where they could get access to all of their goods and supplies and everything, including all the military personnel that are now flocking to Korea's aid, including all the U.S. troops. So this Pusan port was very, very vital to the success of the Korean War. With all the North Koreans going down to Pusan, the UN forces, they formed this perimeter around Pusan, basically in an attempt to try to repel North Korean forces from totally taking over the peninsula. This was their last straw to try to keep a foot in Korea before it was taken over entirely. And this encirclement of Pusan led to the next major battle that I'd like to talk about, which is the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter. The Battle of the Pusan Perimeter was a large-scale battle between United Nations, mostly U.S., and North Korean forces, which lasted from August 4th through September 18th, 1950. It was considered one of the first major engagements of the Korean War, and by the time the North Koreans got down to Pusan, they were facing a total UN force of about 140,000 soldiers from all different nations. Having been pushed to the brink of defeat, these UN troops were rallied to make one final stand against the invading North Korean army, which at that point was 98,000 men strong. UN forces, having been repeatedly defeated by the advancing North Korean People's Army, were forced back to the Pusan Perimeter. The UN troops consisted mostly of forces from the Republic of Korea Army, the U.S. Army, and the British Army, where they mounted a last stand around the perimeter, where they all fought off repeated North Korean attacks for these 6 weeks. The massive North Korean assaults were unsuccessful in forcing the United Nations troops further back from the perimeter, fortunately, despite the North Koreans having 2 major pushes in both August and September. By then, North Korean troops were hampered by supply shortages and massive losses. They continually staged attacks on the UN forces in order to penetrate the perimeter and collapse the line. However, the UN used the port to amass an overwhelming advantage to troops, equipment, and logistics, and its Navy and Air Forces remained unchallenged by the North Koreans during all this fighting. After these 6 weeks of fighting, the North Korean force collapsed and retreated in defeat after the UN force basically launched a counterattack at the port of Inchon on September 15, 1950. This particular battle of the Pusan Perimeter would be the furthest the North Korean troops would advance in the war ever, as subsequent ground war was met into a bloody stalemate. This is where this is starting to be a major turning point in favor of UN forces, because they basically stood their ground for the whole Battle of Pusan. They're like, oh heck no, no matter how hard the enemy tries, we are not giving up this piece of land. We've came all this way to defend these people, we're not going to back down one bit. Well, fortunately, their valiant effort really paid off, and this basically set the stage for the later parts of the Korean conflict. So, after the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter, the next major battle that took place in 1950 was none other than the battle/landing at Inchon. Now, for those of you that don't know, Inchon is a port city about halfway up the Korean peninsula on the west side of the country, and it's barely just southwest of the capital of Seoul for South Korea. And the Battle of Inchon itself is significant because this was an amphibious invasion that resulted in the decisive victory and strategic reversal of the Korean War in favor of the United Nations Command. Now, the operation at Inchon itself involved some 75,000 troops and over 250 naval vessels, which led eventually to the recapture of the South Korean capital of Seoul. The nickname for this particular operation was Operation Chromite, and the Battle of Inchon actually began on September 15th, 1950. It was on that morning the invasion fleet, which was led by Normandy and Leyte Gulf veteran Admiral Arthur Dewey Strobel, moved into the position, and the men of Major General Edward Almonds, Army Corps prepared to land. It was around 6:30 that morning that the first UN troops, which were led by U.S. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Robert Talbot's 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, came ashore at Green Beach on the northern side of Walmedoo. Now, supported by 9 M26 Pershing tanks from the 1st Tank Battalion, the Marines succeeded in capturing the island by noon that day, where they only suffered 14 casualties in the whole process. Through that afternoon, they defended the causeway to Inchon proper while awaiting reinforcements. However, due to the extreme tides in the harbor, the second wave did not arrive until 5:30 that afternoon. And at 5:31, the 1st Marines landed and scaled the seawall at Red Beach. Though under fire from North Korean positions on both Cemetery and Observation Hills, the troops successfully landed and pushed inland. Located just north of the Walmedoo Causeway, the Marines at Red Beach quickly reduced the NKPA opposition, which allowed forces from Green Beach to enter the battle. Now, pressing into Inchon, the forces from Green and Red Beaches were able to take the city of Inchon and compelled the NKPA defenders to surrender. And as all these events were unfolding, the 1st Marine Regiment under Colonel Louis Chesley Polar was landing on Blue Beach just to the south. Though one LST was sunk while approaching the beach, the Marines met little opposition once they were all ashore and quickly moved to help consolidate the UN position. The landings at Inchon caught the NKPA command by surprise. Believing that the main invasion would come at Pusan, the NKPA only sent a small force to the area where the Marines were. So, I guess you could say the battle and landings at Inchon served as the Achilles heel for this stage of the Korean War, because up until that point, there was hardly any hope for UN forces other than defeating the invasion force that was surrounding Pusan. So, as you can see, Pusan is down here in the very southeastern tip of South Korea, almost off the peninsula entirely, and basically what the Inchon landing does is cause a vital distraction for the North Koreans so that UN forces could break the stalemate and the fighting down here. And basically, Inchon was very important because if our Marines and other UN forces had not invaded the port of Inchon, Lord knows what might have happened. And thus, by taking Inchon, basically, this paved the way for our Marines and other UN forces to go all the way up to the South Korean capital of Seoul and retake that from the enemy. So this was very vital for our allies and U.S. forces altogether, which brings me to the next significant battle at this time, which was the Battle of Seoul. The Battle of Seoul was the next objective after the successful landings at Inchon by U.S. and UN forces. In fact, the 5th Marines were the first ones to get to Seoul whenever they lined up along the rail lines just west of the city, which paralleled the Han River. The terrain around Seoul was very challenging, and in fact, on September 21st, the Marines encountered a ridge of hills and set up camp for the night for their incoming invasion of Seoul. The U.S. advance from Inchon was a slow and tedious affair because North Koreans successfully bogged down the Allied advance in that harsh terrain. A T-34 tank assault was launched by the North Korean People's Army, but was successfully cut off and destroyed by the incoming U.S. forces. Similarly, Yank bombing runs were attempted with very little success. So the next morning on September 22nd, 1950, exactly a week after the invasion of Inchon, the Marines finally entered Seoul, and it was a big shock to them because the Marines soon discovered that it was heavily fortified. Now, drawing parallels to the Battle of Manila during World War II, the Marines met very heavy resistance and were forced to take the city house by house, block by block, and as they ground away at the defenders, casualties mounted on both sides. The Americans eventually gained the upper hand, but the battle took a very terrible toll on the forces involved. Now, by this time, both the airport and the main highway going into Seoul was now secured, which allowed the 32nd Infantry into the city via the Han River. And while this is going on, South Korea's 17th Regiment crossed just behind them. At the same time, the 7th Marine Division crossed the Han River further west of the city and moved in to shut off North Korean supply routes from the north. By late in the day on September 25th, UN troops had Seoul completely surrounded, like nobody was coming in and out of that place whatsoever. However, North Korean soldiers and civilian sympathizers still controlled many urban blocks and were not about to give up the city without a fierce fight. UN troops went through the city block by block and building by building again for the next few days, engaged in bloody street fighting until Seoul was completely taken over by UN forces on September 29th, 1950. So guys, the Battle of Seoul was another critical battle in the early stages of the Korean War. So by now, not only have UN and US forces mostly taken over one of the first major ports that North Korea originally took over at Inchon, but now we basically have driven the enemy completely out of the South Korean capital of Seoul. So at this time, we have very, very solid footing in this giant invasion force from North Korea. So this basically was the slimmer of hope that all of UN forces needed and were very grateful to have at that particular time. And because of this Battle of Seoul and Inchon, this gave American and UN troops enough confidence to push the enemy further north, well into North Korea, which is exactly what we did for the next couple of months. That was until a certain ally, aka China, joins the war effort in order to back up North Korea. That started in November of 1950, whenever Chinese soldiers, along with North Korean soldiers, started a very big offensive against American and other UN forces, which leads me to perhaps the most famous battle of the entire Korean War, which, my friends, is the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. The Chosin Reservoir is not only famous for being a part of the Korean War, in fact, it's probably one of the more famous battles in the war itself. But the Chosin Reservoir battle is also a major battle in Marine Corps lore. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir was fought from November 26th through December 11th, 1950, following the Chinese decision to intervene in the Korean War in October of 1950. Chinese forces began crossing the Yalu River in North Korea in very large numbers, where they encountered elements of Major General Edward Almond's 10th Corps, which included the 1st U.S. Marine Division, Chinese troops attempted to overwhelm the Americans near the Chosin Reservoir. Now, this battle was fought in bitterly cold conditions as the Marines of the 1st Marine Division, with the support of the U.S. Army, fought tenaciously to escape from the Chinese. After more than 2 weeks, they finally succeeded in breaking out and were ultimately evacuated from Hungnam on the eastern side of South Korea. As the fighting grew desperate, dozens of wounded U.S. Marines in field hospitals gritted their teeth, grabbed a weapon, and straggled back to the fighting that was ensuing. This was popular because in the Marine Corps, the Marines abided by the slogan, "Every Marine is a rifleman," which included everybody from cooks, mechanics, and drivers. Basically, everybody in the Marine Corps had weapons training, which is still a tradition to this day, where they picked up weapons and they entered the fray on various hills around Chosin. By the morning of November 29th, the Chinese had won control over East Hill and threatened Major General Oliver P. Smith's camp and airfield. As a result, U.S. Marine Colonel Louis Chessie Puller, who commanded the 1st Marine Regiment to the south at Coterie, moved ahead toward Hagueri with some British Royal Marines. The Chinese assaulted the Allied relief column and knocked out many vehicles on the narrow road, which caused a very deadly traffic jam. The Chinese killed more than 300 allies and took a few dozen survivors prisoner. The men in the rear could not get through and returned. About 400 men in the lead made it to the destinations and successfully drove the Chinese from East Hill. They repulsed an attack that night and killed nearly 1,500 Chinese soldiers. As a result of their valiant efforts, the airstrip was completed on December 1st, 1950, which formed a vital link to the outside world, with cargo planes bringing in reinforcements, supplies, as well as carrying out all the wounded that they could. On December 3rd, the severely depleted companies of Marines at Yondamni sneaked their way back to Fox Hill, which was led by Chinese-American Marine Lieutenant Kurt Chu In Lee and helped relieve Fox Company. They subsequently became known as the Ridge Runners. After this, Marine aircraft and artillery helped to open the Tok Tong Pass as approximately 2,000 wounded Marines walked or were carried back to Hagueri. And as dust settled, the bloody, ragged, unshaven, and unwashed Marines in tattered clothing marched into the base. When asked about the retreat, General Smith retorted, "Retreat? Hell, we're just attacking in a different direction." The entire division prepared to fight its way back to the coast, using air power and artillery to decimate the Chinese, who by that point had dug in around the main road and the bridge at the Fonchelin Pass, which they had blasted to prevent the Americans from withdrawing. Marine engineers fortunately fixed the bridge, and the 1st Marine Division marched or rode back to the port of Hungnam to their transports for evacuation, especially for all those who were severely wounded. Army General Ned Almond facilitated the humanitarian evacuation of 100,000 civilian North Koreans to the south, including Army and Marine personnel whenever they arrived there at Hungnam on December 11th, 1950. So, all in all, the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir was a pretty costly battle for both sides of the conflict. The Marines themselves suffered 750 dead and 3,000 wounded as they fought against the Chinese, which inflicted more than 42,000 enemy casualties. which ultimately cost the Chinese Ninth Army Group 2 whole divisions and basically effectively rendered it effective as a fighting force. The Chinese and North Koreans later drove the UN forces back down to the 38th parallel over the next few months, which basically resulted in the rest of the Korean War being fought as a bloody stalemate around the 38th parallel. So, in conclusion, everybody, as we can see, the very first year of the Korean War in 1950 was a very eventful and strategic and important year for all of the forces involved. In a nutshell, in June of 1950, whenever North Korea originally invaded South Korea, they were hoping for a quick victory to reunite all of Korea under communist rule. Well, that didn't exactly happen, and the UN was able to rally a bunch of forces to go to Korea to counter the North Koreans and everything. And fortunately, the sneak tactic of General MacArthur and General Almond of invading the port of Inchon in western South Korea, that was a very bold move on their part, because that helped to break up the fighting force of North Koreans that were about to decimate South Korea and basically paved the way for us to get a stronghold of the Korean Peninsula. And everything was going pretty good until November of 1950, whenever Chinese forces joined the fight against South Korea and UN forces. And I'm just going to say, words cannot describe all of the stuff that Korean veterans of the Chosin Reservoir went through, or as people like to call them, the Chosin Few. That was a very, very bloody battle, and it was a bloodbath for both sides. I mean, literally, as U.S. Marine and Army personnel and other UN forces were retreating from the Chosin Reservoir, Chinese soldiers were basically shooting down on these guys, picking them off one by one, it seemed like. And what's worse is, not only did you have to worry about the enemy shooting at you, but you also had to worry about you freezing to death from frostbite and other stuff from the elements. It was a very unconventional and very bold and very scary battle, to say the least. I do appreciate everybody for sticking around for the entirety of this video, and I know it's a lot of information, but this is going to be important for later on in this series on Korea, because this is going to show you how very important this very first year of the Korean War was, and how it set the stage for the war for the next 3 years. So, again, guys, please leave a like and a comment down below. I really would love to hear your feedback. If it's even some ideas for future content or what you thought of this video, please leave them down below. I would love to hear from you. I really do appreciate everybody tuning in, and y'all have a wonderful rest of your day. Until next time.